Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Elevenses. We have the stunning total of 2 viewers at the moment, so welcome along to both of you. Hopefully we'll get a few more along as we go. I do know that quite a few people are watching it on catch-up these days. What have we got for you in the show today? Well, again, I'm going to be looking at some topical issues, and we'll be covering some bike safety thinking as well, with a report on a fatal crash that I've got some information about. So first story will be about the driving tests. The latest news is that there is still no news from the DFT. We'll do a quick update on the e-scooter trials, and I'll give you a slightly different viewpoint, perhaps from what you've seen before. We'll have a look at better biking, understanding how braking distances actually work, because it's often not really very well explained. And finally, I've got a bonus video link for you. The link's already gone up in the comment stream, so you can have a look at that. And I'll show you, I'll talk about what's happened there. And Mark has just said hello. Good morning to you, Mark. Right, okay. Don't forget, if you have anything to say, the comments, questions, any feedback on the course, do drop me a line. If there's anything you'd like me to talk about, drop me a line. I'm more than happy to do sort of custom bits and pieces if that's what you want. All right, anyway, let's crack on. What's happening with the driving tests? Well, the latest news is that despite the announcements from the government yesterday on the relaxation of lockdown, there is still no news. Now, you may remember that I am a member of the Driving Instructors Association. I've mentioned that before. Excuse me. And after the big round of lockdown easing that went on yesterday, the latest update from the DIA dropped on my virtual mat this morning, and there is still no news on when driving tests, car or bike favour, might be resumed. The DVSA, on the rare occasions when they've actually deigned to talk to the DIA, which I think is on about 3 occasions if I remember correctly, simply say that it's not our fault, Gov, and they pass the buck on to the DFT, saying that that's where they are waiting guidance from. So despite all the statements yesterday about which businesses can open, which businesses have to remain closed, which can operate with social distancing in place, and so on and so forth, on the resumption of driving tests, there's still no news, and driver and rider training is basically being overlooked. And I can't really understand why this might be. Now, presumably, government and Public Health England must have had some, well, we know they had a previous pandemic plan, and it must have assessed the risk of each individual industry. And it is hard to believe that that didn't include driver and rider training. So even though the COVID-19 virus has broken many of the rules, as it were, for viruses, as we learned the hard way, once the issue of asymptomatic carriers was recognised, and once the primary mechanism of transmission was understood to be airborne droplets rather than touching contaminated surfaces, then I don't see why that impact study couldn't have been rapidly revised. So right now, the industry after industry has received guidance on how and when it can reopen, but driver training seems to have dropped into a black hole. And as a result, there are thousands of car and bike instructors struggling to stay afloat because the test system is stalled. We can train people, but we can't take them to test. So how people are supposed to run their businesses without any knowledge from the DFT and the DVSA, I don't honestly know. Frankly, if you can go into a hair salon and you can spend an hour sat in a chair whilst somebody has their hands physically on your head and you're having your hair cut, styled, coloured, whatever, in a closed room, I totally fail to see how driver training in a car can be much more risky if both the driver and the instructor are wearing masks. I mean, there's no reason the instructor couldn't wear a shield as well. You're at a similar kind of distance. You're probably there for a similar kind of time, minus the touching. And you can open the windows in a car too, so you can get that open air environment that they've been talking about as being important. Now, okay, car instructors might have to forego the habit of having 2 or 3 trainees in the same car at the same time, where those who are not actually driving the vehicle are observing from the back seat. But even there are possible strategies. For example, you could form a training bubble, ridiculous term, but it's one that everybody's using, so that a group of people work together to form a sort of a coherent number of people who go for lessons every time together, rather than throwing people in ad hoc. And that way you'd be limiting your contact within a traceable group. Bike trainers, of course, are even better off because we're not even in the same vehicle as the examiner or the instructor. So for riding schools, at least, if trainees are turning up with their own riding kit, you've removed a major headache for the training school. And then really the only thing that the school needs to provide is a radio. And if they do that with a disposable headset every time, then really there is very little that needs physical contact. And if you do what I've done, which is limit the face-to-face contact time by putting my theory and debrief sessions onto Zoom, I really cannot see why full training cannot be resumed by rider training schools right away, absolutely right away. There's no reason I can see for any further delay. Okay, what about the examiner for tests? Well, there's a bit more of a risk for an examiner, simply because he would be presenting himself to half dozen different candidates every day. But surely it's not beyond the wit of man to come up with a solution to this. For starters, if you want to exclude infective candidates, surely each test centre could be given the same kind of temperature monitoring equipment that's being given to schools. So before anybody even gets into the waiting room, you've scanned them and checked they're not running a temperature. And if they are, you send them home. And then everybody from the driving school who's dealt with that trainee self-isolates. That's obvious a solution. And you can do that before they even get anywhere near the waiting room. Now, okay, we have a waiting room trainings at the test centres, but you can socially distance within that. The tests take place 47 minutes apart, if I recall correctly. And what that gives you is the opportunity to stagger tests. So you could, in theory, run half the tests 22 minutes, and then the next batch of tests 22 minutes after, instead of all starting at the same time. That would halve the numbers who are in the waiting room at any one time. Now, you might have to clean that waiting room between groups, but quite frankly, if you can go to the pub on the 4th of July and you can lean on a bar waiting to be served, along with everybody else who's leaning on the bar waiting to be served, then giving the waiting area a wipe down between trainees arriving and departing hardly seems like a deal breaker to me. Similarly, there is an element where there are documents to be handled, and clipboards, for example, have to be, the pass certificate has to be signed. Well, is that any different from handing over a touch card reader or something at the counter? I can't see it myself. And if you're still really concerned about the waiting room, then simply don't allow the candidates into the waiting room, but make them sit in the car and wait for the examiner to come out. The examiner can read the number plate. If you tell them who they're testing, they can come out and find the trainee. It's no big deal. What about on the move? Well, again, it strikes me that there are options here that are possible. For example, there are screens being erected between the checkout assistants in stores. They've been erected in buses between the driver and passengers getting on the bus. Why can't we do something similar in a car? Even in places like the Philippines and Thailand, they've been using plastic screens on motorcycle taxis between the rider and the passenger. So surely something like that could be used. There is a provision within the car test that the examiner may have to take control of the car via the steering wheel. But frankly, should the examiner need to do that? Can't do it on a bike, can they? So, but even so, surely some kind of screen could be put between the examiner and the candidate. There are relatively few models of car that are in common use, particularly by the big chain schools. So surely something like that could be designed relatively inexpensively and relatively quickly. What about disinfecting the inside of the car between trainees? Well, again, it's hardly more of a risk, I would have thought, than sitting on the bus or the train that's cleaned maybe once a day. And quite frankly, the examiner's likely to use a train or a bus to get to work in the first place. So, I don't think there are insurmountable problems here, but there just seems to be a complete lack of action, and training schools are suffering. And I feel for anybody at the moment who's running a basic training school for any reason. What about my own training? Well, quick update on that. Last week, I ran 3 of my socially distanced courses, and for the time being, I'm certainly going to continue to offer those. Basically, as you've heard, what I do on these now is I use face-to-face Zoom conversations to replace the briefings that I would normally do with the trainee. So what that allows me to do is shorten the overall session. That means I can take out the lunch break from the session, as we're not going on for a whole 5 hours on the road. We don't need the lunch stop, and then I can maximize the effectiveness of the time that we do spend together. And so far on those courses, I've received some pretty positive feedback on it. So that's what I will continue to do for the moment, but I'm obviously going to keep everything under review just in case we do finally get some guidance from the DVSA and the DFT. Okay, don't forget, you're watching Kevin Williams here live with the Elevenses show from Survival Skills. And still to come on today's show, we're going to be looking at e-scooters in a moment. I've got an item on better braking understanding about following distances. And we've got a bonus item coming up just next about high vis. Now, I've already put the link up for you on that, so if you care to click that at when you get a moment and have a look at the video, ask yourself, does high vis work? Well, if you have had anything to do with my science of being seen work, that I am less than convinced by the arguments in favor of high vis, specifically the fact that although we've been using high-vis clothing now for over 40 years, I bought my first glow belt back in about 1976, and I was wearing a fluorescent yellow full-on jacket by about 1980. Although we've had 40 plus years of day riding lights and high-vis clothing, there's no evidence that it's had any significant effect on the distribution of collisions. If you expected these aids to help drivers see motorcycles at junctions, what you would expect to see in the accident stats is a movement away from collisions at junctions into crashes in other areas, and it's simply not happened. The junction collision is still by far and away the commonest crash that a rider will have. So it's something like almost 70% of all crashes in London, for example, happen at junctions. And in the vast majority of cases, it's the driver who doesn't see the rider, although the opposite does happen, and riders even collide with each other. So as I've been saying, for the last 8-9 years since I created the Science of Being Seen, the point at which the driver makes this looked but failed to see error is really, really close to the biker on an urban street. If you think about your stopping distance from 30 odd miles per hour, you should be able to stop if you're alert, and we'll come on to that in the next item actually, should be able to stop in 10 meters or less. Now, if you or anybody else cannot see a motorcycle 10 meters away, then there is something seriously wrong with your eyesight. And the fact is that most people can see a motorcycle 10 meters away without any problem at all. There are relatively few drivers who are driving with such poor eyesight that they shouldn't be on the road. So there's something else happening. Now, if you have a look at the video, you'll see that the high-vis clothing clearly makes absolutely no difference in this collision. The bike almost certainly had its headlight on as well, although we can't see that. So if the driver didn't see the bike, watch the rider's own head movements. And in particular, what you'll see is that he doesn't glance at the car. Because if he had done, then just a toot of the horn as he saw that car start to move forward over the giveaway light might have stopped the car in its tracks. If he'd been on something a little bit more powerful than the scooter, maybe a slight tweak of the throttle would have accelerated him out of trouble. But of course, neither happened, and the result is he ends up on the bonnet of the car. Now, oddly enough, a video was doing the rounds just a few days ago on media. I could only find it on a newspaper site, which is why I haven't copied it over, because I can't download it. But a police rider was nearly taken out on a roundabout in not dissimilar circumstances. What actually happened was the driver got lost on the island and actually continued to turn right from the left-hand lane straight across the motorcyclist path. And this was all caught on his colleague's camera. The rider had to do a fairly brisk stop. I'll see if I can find it again, and I'll share it on Sunday. You can at least have a look at that anyway. Anyway, thanks to John Long for the link for that particular video. Don't forget, you are watching Elevenses with Ken Williams and Survival Skills. If you want something to read, if you are still not riding like my upstairs neighbour who's still furloughed, you can come over to my Survival Skills page on Lulu and have a look at my books over there. Right, okay, so I'll finish off with an item on better understanding of braking and following distances, but let's just give you an update on the e-scooter trials that are coming soon. Now, I did talk at some length about this on Sunday, but I think it's worth repeating again, because again, slightly different take on the story. On Sunday, I mentioned the government is pushing forward and broadening the scope of the trials of rented e-scooters. They originally planned to go ahead in 4 locations, but now there are pilot projects going ahead in at least a dozen British towns and cities. And the aim is to relieve pressure on public transport caused by the coronavirus. Under this scheme, private scooters will still be banned. Now, the DFT was originally supposed to publish their framework today, but it's been delayed, apparently because they are still discussing who will be eligible to ride these scooters. As soon as that's resolved, then the framework will be released, and that's now expected to be next week. Now, the latest news, which is an update to what I gave you on Sunday, is that these e-scooters will be allowed to use public roads as well as cycle lanes and cycle tracks. And of course, they will be exempt from vehicle registration and licensing regulations. However, they will require insurance, and they will also be limited to 12.5 miles per hour, which is a new restriction. There'll be no legal requirement to wear a helmet. There's no word on lighting and an audible warning, such as a horn or a bell, but I would guess that both will be a requirement. So on the one hand, there are obviously clear benefits to switching from e-scooters for making small journeys. Analysis suggests that something like 60% of all car journeys in the UK are of between 1 and 5 kilometres. And in a survey in Finland, they found that 41% of the people who responded to the study, although you always have to be a little bit careful with things like this, because people who haven't used them probably won't respond. People who have are more likely to. 41% of the respondents said they replaced taxi rides or private car journeys with e-scooter trips. Almost 1 in 5 said they'd use them for business trips. Fredrik Helm, the chief executive of Voi, which is a Scandinavian e-scooter rental company, says that cities need to give people more transport options to help them get around without resorting to cars. As we have demonstrated in Sweden, Finland, Denmark and Germany, we can replace short car journeys for 1 to 3 miles with e-scooter trips. But have a think about that figure, because it reveals, or rather it conceals, two issues which never seem to be discussed. Where does your journey actually start from? Well, most journeys start from home by definition. That's where you set off from. You may make intermediate stops and you may be returning to home, but most of the time your journey begins from home. Now, where are these scooters kept? Like rental e-bikes, they're not going to be available from our front door. So we have to make a journey on one of these in the first place. If you happen to live within a small city, small town, it's possible that you can walk to a bay where these things are going to be parked. Well and good if they are. But I live 7 miles from the centre of London, and I have no idea where the nearest electric rental bicycles are parked. It's certainly not within any walking distance of where I live. And so if I have to take public transport to get to the pickup point for one of these hire e-scooters, then just like the hire e-bikes, the whole object of the exercise is defeated in the first place. The second thing is that it's often assumed that any journey that's made in a car can be made on an e-bike or an e-scooter, but that's clearly not the case. You can't carry two people on an e-scooter. So if you're taking a child to school, for example, and remember, not all schools are just around the corner. Some are a couple of miles away, and people maybe are dropping kids off on the way to work or something like, or to do another chore like shopping. Some car journeys cannot be replaced easily by e-bikes and e-scooters. You cannot do a week's shopping for 5 or 6 people on an e-bike or an e-scooter. Even if you go every day, you're going to be struggling to carry those shopping bags. So, the car does have a role to play, and you cannot replace all journeys with these vehicles. And there are various operating problems. I mean, they sit unhappily, I think, between pedestrians and motorized vehicles, and they coexist with neither. One of the things that they found with bicycles is that they don't actually work well in shared space. This was something that was pushed very hard 20 odd years ago. The idea was that you took out all the restrictions and you got everything working together and everybody would cooperate, and the accident rate on bicycles actually went up. So we know that's why we have more and more dedicated cycle lanes, and why roads have been narrowed, barriers have been put in, and cycles have been given their own specific space to work with. It's the same with pavements. We've taken pavements away in some places, and we have shared space, but it's a very, very unique situation if that works. Mostly it doesn't. Mostly we still walk on pavements and cars stick to the road. These things are not suitable for use on pavements. Pedestrians, rightly, in my opinion, see them as dangerous. And in the US, there's been what's been described as scooter rage, and these things have been seized by pedestrians and thrown into rivers. Now, something that I did notice was that trial sets the speed of the e-scooter at several miles per hour less than the maximum speed that you can reach by pedaling an e-bike and still have the motor assist you. You can go faster on an e-bike, but the electric assistance cuts out. So it's slightly odd that they'll make a dual speed system using cycle lanes. There's also a justifiable concern, in my opinion, about their use on the roads, which are often bumpy, potholed, covered in slippery manhole covers, and where there is a significant speed difference between these scooters and other vehicles. So there are some operating questions still to be answered, I think. And then there's a question of who actually gets to provide the scooters. Now, in London, the e-bike rental surge that followed the Boris bike experiment led to too many companies being given operating licenses. In the first case, what it led to was a sort of a surfeit of unridden bikes clogging up pavements. And almost as soon as they started, several companies realized there was no money to be made in it, so they pulled out. And there's a clear risk the same will happen with e-scooters if people are too keen to hand out licenses. And there's also the question of recovering the used bike and the scooter, which is abandoned at random. You often sort of walk down the pavement here and you'll find one of these bikes blocking the pavement completely, where someone's just literally parked it and walked off. Yeah, there are no facilities for parking these things at the end of their journey. And I think there's been a less well-reported issue as well, and that's theft. The security mechanism that stops a e-bike being ridden if it's not being paid for, it hardly stops somebody throwing it in the back of the van. A few minutes work with a hacksaw, get it off. So it mightn't seem a high value item, but I've certainly seen a few re-sprayed, barely disguised Boris bikes being peddled around quite openly. Okay. There are around 30 councils at the moment who are interested in these pilot studies, which are expected to run for 12 months. But if they do take off, the real reason for them is money. There's money to be made. Now, a chap called Hamish Stewart, who's organised the London Car Free Day, says that during the crisis, we've seen lots of people realising they don't need a car to make short trips, and the decision to accelerate e-scooter trials will provide a non-polluting way for people to travel, etc. Richard Dilks, who's chief executive of CoMo UK, which is a shared transport organisation, said e-scooter trials will help pivot us further to more sustainable transport, which we urgently need given transport's record on greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I think they're both wrong if they're encouraging rental. Placing e-scooters in the hands of people who want to make money out of them is not going to drive us towards a greener urban landscape when you look at the broader picture. According to a Guardian story on the issue, Voi, as I mentioned earlier, who rent out e-scooters in Scandinavia, they estimate they could provide up to 100,000 daily rides across London. Now, if e-bike pricing is followed and a typical ride is about 15 minutes long, that could net the renting company £3 per ride. Do the sums. Multiply that by 100,000 rides and you get £300,000 a day, or 100 million a year for the operating company if those figures hold true. The global e-scooter market was recently valued at $20 billion, but is estimated to become worth $42 billion by 2030. Now, I can see a role for e-scooters. I've said that before. I think we have to look beyond what we're used to and start accepting that we share the roads and we don't have exclusive use to it, whether we're drivers or motorcyclists. But I think that, like e-bikes, e-scooters have to be available for personal use. I think you have to permit the private usage of these things. And if that requires insurance, then so be it. But here's a radical idea for you. Instead of handing them over to private companies to make money, why not give local councils the power to operate their own schemes? After all, they are cash strapped at the moment. They are suffering, particularly from the Coronavirus Council. This is a way that money could be fed into the community rather than handed over to someone who's going to put it in their pocket. Right, okay. That was my little rant. Set a reminder. Every Wednesday and Friday, you can watch Elevenses at 11 with me here, Kevin Williams. You can also catch up on my YouTube channel, Survival Skills UK, or you can find it on YouTube, LinkedIn. I've even got a link on Instagram, and of course, there's my coffee page, which I'll give you a link to in a minute. Right, okay, on to the final item for the day, and that's about braking. Now, I've mentioned this before, my press feed is full of crash reports, unfortunately, and with biking pretty much back to normal, it's full up of crash accidents. Now, most of the reports that come to me are bare factual reports that a crash has happened. So we know somebody has been hurt or perhaps sadly killed. We know the road is closed. We know the police are investigating, and that's it. We never, ever hear anything else. We never get to be able to see what happened and find out what caused the crash. But yesterday, a report actually appeared in the feed, which came from an inquest, and it provided enough information to understand what had happened. And it's really a very sad tale of a very commonplace manoeuvre ending up with what appears to be a fairly minor bump, but which spilled the rider into the road where he was run over by an oncoming car. Here's what happened, as far as I can tell from the inquest. The rider was following two cars. Both cars slowed down because there was a cyclist ahead and a car was coming the other way. One car went through the gap, the second car didn't. And here's what the second car driver actually had to say. She said she was aware of a silver motorcycle travelling at a safe distance behind her. car overtook the cyclist ahead of her, but she stayed back as it was not safe to follow. At that point, she said she felt a bang at the back of the car. Now, switching to the driver coming the other way, she said she remembered seeing a blue car on the opposite side of the road with a motorbike right behind it and thinking to herself, why is he so close? She then saw the motorcyclist flip out into the road in front of her after hitting the blue vehicle. She took evasive action by braking as hard as she could and steered as far to the left as she could go, but she still ended up colliding with the motorcyclist, who sadly died of his injuries at the scene. Now, there are two stories to learn from this incident, tragic story. First is that we're incredibly vulnerable lying in the road in the middle of traffic. Many years ago, I had my own brush with the Grim Reaper. A pedestrian stepped out in front of me as I was dispatching. I was going around the Aldwych at the time, and he walked straight onto a zebra crossing with absolutely no warning. And in taking evasive action, I locked up the front wheel of the bike and fell off. I remember very, very distinctly rolling onto my back and looking behind me to see a Route Master bus headed straight towards me. The driver fortunately managed to pull off an emergency stop, but as the bus came to a halt, I had a worm's eye view of the front offside tyre. Another metre or two, and I wouldn't be here to tell you this tale. Even though I have that personal experience behind me, I was still shocked to learn on a bike safe course that I took back in about 2002 that almost 50% of all fatalities in London happen when a rider's filtering. Now, most of us assume filtering is a fairly safe activity because, generally speaking, there are the odd loonies, we keep the speed fairly low. And we think that if we only hit something at a low speed, then no serious injury can result. But the problem is it only needs a slight nudge and we're going to drop the bike, and then we are going to be in a vulnerable position. And of course, it's not just the stopping ourselves, it's the stopping behind us. On another occasion, I had an incident in Luxembourg when I was following a car driver who was a bit confused by the road layout. She stopped rather suddenly when actually she didn't need to. She had right of way at a junction. I was behind her at a safe distance. I stopped, but the driver behind me was a local, knew the road layout, knew we had priority, was taken completely by surprise and ran into the back of my bike. Not hard, but it was hard enough to make me lose my footing. And again, I toppled over sideways. Now, I was lucky. I fell towards the pavement rather than towards the centre of the road, and there wasn't anything coming anyway. But picture the consequences if that had happened on a busy road and I'd fallen under oncoming vehicles. We can be wearing all the safety kit we like. We can have a top-of-the-range helmet. We can be clad in the best jacket, gloves, boots possible. We can have a full outfit of body armour. And it will make absolutely no difference if 2 tons of car runs us over. So it is really absolutely essential to stay upright, even in slow-moving traffic. Now, the second thing we can learn here is that assuming that drivers will take a course of action that keeps us safe is an iffy place to go. It sounds very much like what happened was the rider saw the first car going past the cyclist and assumed that the second car would follow. That would explain why he was initially at a safe distance and why that distance closed down as the second oncoming driver saw what was going on and why he ran into the back of the car. When the driver didn't go for the gap, he was basically taken by surprise. Now, if you spend too much time on the Survival Skills Facebook page, you'll know I talk a lot about the concept of surprise and the no surprise, no accident initiative that I've been working on. And this is essential to understand stopping distances. The highway code, if you get back to it and have a look, on the back cover or online, you'll find a chart of stopping distances. We learn it to pass the test. Most of us promptly forget it. The only people I ever meet who memorize it are those who've probably been through the IM and ROSPA. Everybody out on the road pretty much ignores them anyway. But the problem with highway code, even though they are on the back of this document and they're considered to be important, is that they miss something important out. They have 2 components. They have the shorter period of time, the reaction time, which is essentially the time it takes for the brain to send a signal down our arm to the muscles and the muscles to start to move, whether we're grabbing the brake or we are treading on the lever on the floor. The second and longer component of this stopping distance is the time it actually takes for our bike to start to pull up. And that's related to speed and how hard we're applying the brakes in the first place. Now, the fact is, when we are in a genuine emergency and police do accident reconstructions, it often turns out that we don't pull up in the distance that we could do according to the highway code. We don't simply beat it, as Jeremy Clarkson likes to remind us. Cars have got better brakes than Morris Minor that they used for those figures. We don't match them. We're not as good as the highway code suggests we should be. And what's the problem then? And the answer is there's something missing. It's what's called recognition time. This is time it actually takes for us to recognize the situation in front of us, how it's developing, and what we need to do about it. In other words, it's whether or not we're expecting something to happen. Once we are not expecting something to occur, once it happens in a way that we're not prepared for, then there's a significant delay before we react. And that's what the indication is that happened here. I suspect the rider was expecting both cars to pass the cycle, and then taken by surprise, he was now too close to stop because it took him that moment of time to realize the car in front wasn't moving. It brings me back to what I continually talk about on my courses. Plan for things to go wrong out on the road. Don't plan to do them the best possible way you can. Don't worry about perfect performance. Look after yourself and think about imperfect performance in other road users. Safety doesn't come from high levels of technique. It comes from high levels of awareness of how other drivers might get it wrong, how we might get it wrong. So that's what we need to plan for. We need to look out for imperfect performance, our own and other road users. Having an awareness of risk, having a strategy to deal with the worst case scenario is where rider training should head, not in polishing your riding and making it gleam and glisten. It's all about being pragmatic on the road. My courses aren't called survival skills for nothing. Trust me, there's no chance in that. I learned the hard way as a motorcycle courier just how easy it was to make a minor mistake, like being a little bit too close to a car in front when it stopped suddenly, or having a car behind a little bit too close when I stopped suddenly. And I nearly ended up under a bus. Right, okay, if you want to look into what I do, you can come over to the Survival Skills webpage, survivalskills.co.uk. If you've enjoyed the show, you can find a lot more content of what I'm talking about, prior articles on Facebook, over on my coffee page. There, the URL is there. So, yeah, I hope you've enjoyed today's little talks. Drop me a line if you've got any feedback. As I said, hopefully we will see you again on Sunday. So for the moment, from Kevin Williams here at Elevenses, thank you for watching and see you again soon. Bye for now.